On a crisp, early morning outside Buckingham Palace, the steady, unwavering gaze of the Queen's royal guard locked onto the bustling scene around him. He was a stoic figure, towering in his bright red tunic and towering black bearskin hat, trained to ignore all distractions. The crowds were already gathering despite the hour, each person angling for a closer view of the palace gates, each hoping to catch a glimpse of something extraordinary in this iconic part of London. Yet today was different. In the middle of the crowd, unseen by many, a little girl stood watching the palace guards. She was small, just tall enough to peek through the iron gates, her wide eyes filled with wonder. Her presence seemed almost surreal. A young black girl, no older than 7, dressed in soft, mismatched pajamas covered in bright pink and blue stars, her tiny frame tucked into fuzzy slippers that whispered with each step. She clutched a well-loved teddy bear close to her side as if it were a source of courage. Her natural hair was braided neatly, but sleep still lingered on her face, as if she'd wandered out of a dream and into this new world, half awake and yet drawn to something only she could see. Slowly, her gaze fixed on one of the royal guards standing stone-faced and immobile by the gate. To the bystanders, he was another figure in the grand spectacle, but to this girl, he seemed something else entirely. With a deep breath, her small feet began to carry her forward through the crowd, slipping through legs and around grown-ups distracted by their cameras and smartphones, until she stood just a few feet from the guard. She looked up, her wide eyes studying his face, wondering if he would notice her, if he would break his perfect stillness just for a moment. For several long seconds, she just watched him, her expression soft but determined. Then, in a voice that was both soft and impossibly brave, she whispered, "Excuse me, mister. I need to ask you something." The guard didn't move. Of course he couldn't. He was trained not to respond, not to react. But the little girl didn't waver. She took another step closer, lifting her teddy bear as if he, too, was part of her question, her tiny voice cutting through the crowd's murmurs. "Please, mister, can you help me?" At this, something flickered in the guard's gaze. His orders were clear, his training rigid, but for the briefest moment, he couldn't help but wonder. What was this child doing here? And why was she so alone? Finally, as if breaking some silent barrier, he responded, not with words, but with the smallest nod. He could feel the weight of the crowd's attention shifting towards this strange scene unfolding. People began to notice the little girl now, some of them starting to take videos, whispers spreading through the crowd. But she didn't seem to care about any of them. Her focus was only on him. The guard cleared his throat supply and leaned down ever so slightly, enough that only she would hear his words. "What do you need, little one?" Her face lit up as if his simple question was the best gift anyone could have given her. She looked up at him, a flicker of hesitation crossing her face before she spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "My mommy told me that guards are brave and they protect people." "Are you brave?" He felt his heart tighten at her question. He'd been asked many things in his career as a guard, but this simple question was somehow different. This wasn't just a curious child seeking a smile or a quick picture. This was a child who seemed to truly need something from him. Maybe it was the way she clutched her teddy bear or the slight tremor in her voice, but he felt something inside him shift, a need to give her an answer, the right answer. "Yes," he said softly, "I'm brave." She looked down at her teddy, having it even tighter, as if gathering courage from his words. Her next words were shaky but determined. "Then, can you help me find my mommy?" He froze. The weight of her words settled heavily around them, and suddenly, the lively chatter of the crowd seemed distant, fading into an eerie quiet as her plea lingered in the air. The guard's mind raced. He was just one man assigned to a role he had trained for years to perfect. A role that rarely involved breaking protocol, much less handling lost children. He could feel his heart pound in his chest as he looked into her innocent eyes. The responsibility felt overwhelming. I will help you," he murmured, his words carrying the weight of a promise. Without breaking his stance, he subtly reached for his radio, signaling for backup. It was a simple gesture, but it had an immediate effect. Within moments, another guard appeared in the distance, followed by a few palace staff members, all with serious, concerned expressions. But as they approached, the little girl looked up at the guard with those same wide, hopeful eyes, unaware of the ripple she'd started, oblivious to the attention building around her. All she saw was someone who was brave, someone who had promised to help her. And in that moment, the stoic, unbreakable guard found himself wondering if this was the moment he would truly be tested. As more guards gathered, the crowd thickened, cameras raised to capture every second. The guard knew he couldn't let her down now, not with her tiny hand resting on the rough fabric of his coat, not with the world watching and this innocent child looking up at him with so much trust. He took a deep breath, meeting her gaze. And then he asked, "Can you tell me what your mommy looks like?" The little girl paused, tilting her head as she seemed to search her memory. Her tiny brow furrowed in concentration, her fingers absent-mindedly smoothing the fur of her teddy bear. She has curly hair like mine," she whispered, her voice barely reaching his ears over the murmurs of the crowd gathering around them. "And she smells like roses. She always smells like roses." The guard nodded, listening intently, his own focus sharpened by the details she offered, small and innocent as they were. There was something achingly vulnerable about her, something that tugged at him, urging him to protect her as if she were his own child. This was no ordinary day, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, heavier than the ceremonial bearskin hat atop his head. This was the kind of moment that his training hadn't prepared him for, the kind of moment he knew would stay with him forever. The crowd around them grew, people peering over one another, some murmuring questions, others speculating about what was happening. Phones were lifted, cameras zooming in, all capturing this curious scene of a child speaking earnestly to a royal guard as if they were the only two people in the world. The guard remained focused on her, shielding her as best he could from the curious onlookers. He could feel her growing anxious, sensing the eyes upon her, and instinctively he shifted his stance to block her from view, creating a small protective barrier between her and the crowd. The other guards had gathered now, forming a loose circle around them, their faces serious, their eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of her mother. One of the guards leaned in, speaking in a low voice to the girl. "Do you know where you last saw your mummy, sweetheart? Were you nearby?" The girl looked down, her fingers tightening around her bear's arm, worry clouding her big brown eyes. I think she was talking to someone, near the big fountain," she said softly. "But then there were so many people, and I thought she was right behind me, so I walked a little bit to look at the guards." She hesitated, her lip trembling slightly. But when I turned around, she was gone. A cold wave washed over the guard as he listened. He could almost see it, the simple miscalculation of a little girl curious to see the world, wandering just a few steps away, only to realize too late how easily she could get lost in the tide of people. He glanced at the other guards, exchanging a silent look of shared urgency. They knew that in a place as crowded as this, even the smallest mistake could turn into something far more serious. The senior guard stepped forward, his voice calm and reassuring. "We'll find her. We'll make sure you get back to her, all right?" He promised, his words carrying the practiced authority of years spent handling all manner of situations. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed a hint of worry, the kind of concern only a parent or someone who'd seen too much could fully understand. He knew, too, that this wasn't a situation they could delay. Every passing second mattered. The little girl nodded, though she still clutched her teddy as if it were the only anchor in a confusing world. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "Mommy always says that knights are brave and kind." "Aren't you a knight?" The question caught the guard by surprise, but he managed a small, soft smile, something rare to see on the stony face of a palace guard. "I'm not a knight," he said gently, "but I am here to protect people, especially little girls who need help." She looked at him with a sullen expression, as if weighing his words. There was a trust in her eyes that filled him with a fierce sense of duty, a feeling that he couldn't and wouldn't let her down. He could sense how scared she was, even if she tried to hide it, and it only strengthened his resolve. Meanwhile, the senior guard was already issuing orders over his radio, summoning additional personnel to search the surrounding area. "This is a possible lost child situation," he said quietly but firmly into the microphone clipped to his collar. "Requesting all available units to search for a woman, late 20s, possibly with curly hair. She may respond to the name Mummy." There was a flicker of dark humor in his voice at the last part, but everyone knew the stakes were real. The palace staff was quickly mobilizing, spreading out among the crowd with discreet efficiency, scanning faces, calling out, and asking if anyone had seen a woman looking for her daughter. But in a sea of tourists and families, all moving from one landmark to the next, one face easily blended into another, and the urgency of the search only increased. The guard continued to speak softly to the girl, his voice a steady, calming presence. "What's your name?" he asked, crouching down so that he was closer to her level. The girl looked up at him, her wide eyes still glistening with the beginnings of tears. "My name is Amara," she replied, her voice tiny but proud. "Amara Jones." "Amara," he repeated, smiling just a little. "That's a beautiful name. Do you know your mommy's name too?" She nodded, clutching her teddy bear so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Her name is Jade," she whispered. "Jade Jones." Her voice broke slightly, as if the weight of saying her mother's name brought the reality of her absence crashing down on her small shoulders. He nodded, his heart clenching as he spoke into his radio again. "We're looking for Jade Jones. She has a young daughter here with us, Amara Jones. Please keep an eye out for anyone who fits the description." Around them, more people had gathered, some whispering in hushed voices, others snapping photos or recording videos, unaware of how much the little girl was struggling to stay brave in front of them. The guard kept his focus on her, blocking out the curious bystanders. "Amara," he said gently, "can you tell me what your teddy bear's name is?" She looked at him, surprised at the question, but it was just what she needed to steady herself. "His name is Max," she replied, hugging the bear close. "Mommy gave him to me when I was little, and he's been with me ever since." "Well, Max is a very good bear," the guard said, his voice warm and reassuring. "And he's going to help us too, okay?" She managed a small, hopeful smile at that, nodding as if somehow the mention of her teddy bear had made her feel safer. But even as she smiled, he could see the fear lingering in her eyes, the worry that gnawed at her young heart. He knew that she was doing her best to be brave, but that bravery was slipping as each second passed without a sign of her mother. The guards exchanged glances, their expressions grave as they continued their search. This wasn't a situation any of them had trained for, and yet they all felt the same fierce determination to bring this little girl back to her mother, to protect her in any way they could. Each of them knew the risks, knew that a child separated in such a crowded place could so easily be lost in the shuffle, could wander even farther afield or worse, encounter someone with bad intentions. They couldn't let that happen. Finally, the guard crouched down again, his eyes meeting Amara's. "Listen, Amara, I know this feels scary right now, but I promise we're going to do everything we can to find your mommy, and until we do, I'm not going anywhere. I'll stay with you, and Max will too, all right?" Amara's small hand reached out, and the guard gently took it in his own, his heart breaking a little as her fingers tightened around his. It was a simple gesture, but in that moment it was everything, a silent promise, a lifeline, and a comfort. They waited together, surrounded by the bustling crowd and the growing concern of onlookers, yet somehow alone in a fragile world of their own, bound by an unspoken promise of safety and courage. But as the minutes ticked by, with no sign of her mother and no word from the search teams, a dark unease began to settle over the guards. The crowd around Buckingham Palace grew thicker, the curious onlookers watching as more guards subtly coordinated their search. Amara clung to her teddy bear and the guard's hand, her small fingers wrapped tightly around his, as though he were her last anchor in a sea of strangers. Every so often she glanced around, her eyes scanning faces, hoping to see her mother's familiar smile in the crowd, but each time she only saw strangers, all of them staring back. Despite the calm expressions of the guards around her, Amara sensed something, the worry in the slight frown on the guard's face, the quiet urgency in the voices on the radios, the glances exchanged among the palace staff. Though she was just a child, she could feel the tension building around her. And the more she felt it, the closer she held her teddy bear, whispering to him as if he could somehow keep her fears at bay. Meanwhile, the senior guard had expanded the search zone, sending teams to scan the nearby streets and landmarks where tourists often gathered. He directed a few officers towards the main gates and others toward the vast gardens beyond the palace. His mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. There was no denying the urgency now. In the massive, bustling city of London, A missing child could disappear without a trace. He tried to keep his voice steady as he gave instructions, but beneath the surface, his own concern was growing. As the minutes ticked by, the tension only seemed to deepen. Amara's eyes were beginning to water, though she tried to stay brave, glancing up at her new friend, the guard who had so far stayed by her side, unwavering. She squeezed his hand again, her small fingers finding comfort in the warmth of his grip. "Do you think she's looking for me too?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The guard crouched down so that he was eye level with her, a gentle smile crossing his face, despite the worry in his eyes. "I'm sure she is, Amara. I bet she's doing everything she can to find you. And we're going to make sure you're back together soon, all right?" She nodded, but the look in her eyes said that she was not entirely convinced. The crowd was starting to overwhelm her, the sounds, the murmurs, the flashing cameras. To her, it all felt like a maze she couldn't escape. Her vision began to blur as she fought back tears, her tiny voice trembling. I thought I'd just be gone for a minute. I didn't think." Her words faded, lost in the quiet hum of her distress. As they waited, Amara's thoughts drifted back to her mother, and she remembered their morning together. Her mother had let her choose her own clothes today, even though she had insisted on pajamas instead of her regular clothes, a little adventure that had seemed harmless in the comfort of their hotel. They'd planned a whole day of exploring, and her mother had promised her ice cream and a visit to the toy store. She remembered her mother's laugh, the way she always made her feel safe, and now that safety felt so far away. The guard noticed her face growing more anxious, and in an attempt to distract her, he asked, "Amara, what's your favorite toy? Besides Max, of course." Her face brightened just a little at the mention of her favorite things. "I have a big dollhouse," she said softly, managing a tiny smile. "Mommy got it for me last Christmas. It's pink and blue with little beds and a tiny kitchen, but I always make Max the boss. He has his own room at the top." The guard chuckled, nodding as though he could picture the tiny world she was describing. "Sounds like Max has it pretty good," he said with a warm smile. "You're a great friend to him." She looked at her bear, her smile fading a bit. "I think he's scared too," she whispered. "He misses her like I do." Just as she spoke, the guard caught sight of someone weaving through the crowd toward them, their expression serious, purposeful. It was one of the palace staff members who had been helping with the search. She approached the guard, giving a discreet nod to Amara before speaking in a low, urgent voice. "We haven't found her mother yet," she said, her tone grim. But there was a report from one of the officers at the park entrance. They spotted a woman matching the description, looking distressed. She was seen heading toward the main road. The guard's expression tightened, the seriousness of the situation settling in. He glanced down at Amara, whose hopeful eyes were watching him closely, picking up on every unspoken word. He knew he had to keep her calm, but his mind was racing. If her mother was moving further from the palace, there was a chance they could miss each other entirely. He could feel the pressure mounting, the responsibility of keeping Amara safe growing heavier by the second. The palace staff member looked at Amara with a gentle smile. "Amara, honey, we're getting closer to finding your mommy," she said in a soft, encouraging voice. "But we need you to be very brave, just a little longer." Amara nodded, though her small hand tightened around the guard's once more. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "Will you stay with me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He gave her a reassuring nod, his hand resting on her shoulder. "I'm not going anywhere, Amara. I'll be right here with you until we find her." As they waited, the guard's thoughts drifted to his own family, to the children he hadn't seen in months because of his service to the palace. He imagined what it would be like if one of his own children were lost in a strange city, how terrified he would be, and he felt a renewed sense of duty. Amara was a stranger, yes, but she was also a child, and in that moment, she felt as close to him as family. He was determined to see her safe, no matter what it took. Moments later, the radio crackled again, and a voice came through with an update. "We've got a woman who matches the description. She's near the north entrance, looking very distressed. Possible match. She's calling out for a little girl named Amara." Relief washed over the guard's face, but he kept his expression calm for Amara's sake. He leaned down, smiling at her with a gentleness that held a promise. "Amara, I think we might have found her. She's nearby, just a little further away. Let's go see if it's her, all right. Amara's eyes lit up with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. She held onto her teddy bear with one hand and the guard's hand with the other, nodding eagerly. Please, let's go. I want to see her. I want to see Mommy. The guard kept his pace steady, leading her through the gathering crowd with the other guards flanking them. It felt as though the entire world had stopped, everyone's attention focused on this small, brave girl and her journey to find her mother. The crowd parted to let them through, some people whispering encouragement, others simply watching with soft smiles, moved by the scene before them. As they neared the north entrance, the anticipation grew, and Amara's tiny hand tightened around his even more. She could barely contain her excitement, her feet practically bouncing with each step. But just as they approached, the guard's heart sank slightly. There was no sign of the woman who had been calling for Amara. He scanned the area, his gaze darting from one person to the next, searching for any sign of her mother. But as the moments ticked by and the space remained empty, a gnawing worry crept back in. He could see Amara's face begin to cloud with confusion, her eyes searching the area with a growing sense of unease. Where is she? Amara asked, her voice trembling, her hopes starting to falter. The guard squeezed her hand, his heart heavy but his voice steady. We're close, Amara. Sometimes things take just a little longer than we want, but we're not giving up. She nodded, though her expression remained uncertain, her young face reflecting the deep worry only a lost child could feel. The guards exchanged tense glances, knowing that they were closer, yet somehow still so far from resolving the mystery. The palace staff continued their search, the urgency growing as they combed through the nearby streets, asking passers-by and scanning every corner. And though hope lingered, a quiet tension remained, building with each second that passed without finding her mother. The guard stayed close to Amara, her silent protector, knowing that their search was far from over. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of a mother's desperate voice called out, growing fainter in the echoing city streets. As the minutes dragged on, an uneasy silence fell over the gathered crowd. Amara clung to the guard's hand, her small fingers shaking slightly despite her brave face. She kept scanning the faces around her, eyes darting in every direction, desperate to catch a glimpse of her mother's familiar curls or the rose scent that would comfort her in an instant. But each time her hopeful gaze settled on a stranger instead, her face fell just a little bit more. The guard felt his own heart pounding, his mind racing through every possible outcome. He glanced down at Amara, trying to keep his expression calm and encouraging, but he knew they were running out of time. He couldn't shake the urgency pressing down on him, an instinct warning him that they needed to find her mother soon. He gave her hand a gentle squeeze, hoping it would somehow assure her that she wasn't alone. Amara, he said softly, bending down so he was eye level with her. Do you remember anything else that could help us find her? Maybe where you came from before you walked over to see us? Amara thought hard, her small face scrunching with concentration. We were near the big fountain, she whispered, clutching her teddy bear close. And there were lots of people. Mommy was talking to someone. I didn't see their face, but I think she was asking them something. I thought she'd be right behind me, but... The guard nodded, his mind putting together pieces of the puzzle as she spoke. Whoever her mother had been speaking to might know something, someone who had been near the fountain, who could give them a clue or, at the very least, help them figure out which way her mother might have gone. He radioed the other guards, quietly relaying this information, instructing them to spread out in every direction from the fountain, asking anyone who might have been nearby if they'd seen a woman with curly hair speaking to a stranger. The other guards nodded, slipping into the crowd to follow his orders, while he stayed close to Amara, determined not to let her out of his sight. Meanwhile, Amara's hope seemed to waver. Her eyes were wide, uncertain, a mix of worry and hope dancing across her young face. She looked up at the guard, her voice small but full of a fragile trust. You won't leave me, right? The guard smiled softly, his expression warm despite the tension in his eyes. No, Amara. I promised I'd stay, and I'd always keep my promises. She nodded, clinging to that promise as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. But the longer they waited, the more the crowd began to murmur, their voices mingling with the sounds of the city, creating a restless hum that seemed to close in around them. The tension was thick, and even the onlookers, who had started as curious bystanders, now watched with bated breath, sensing that something crucial was happening before them. A palace staff member returned, her expression grave, but with a hint of determination in her eyes. There was a woman who saw her mother speaking to someone. A man, tall, dark jacket, seemed to be offering directions, she said in a low, urgent tone to the guard. She thought nothing of it at the time, but she noticed they walked off in opposite directions shortly afterward. The guard's heart sank. If Amara's mother had gone looking for her in the wrong direction, it could mean she was wandering even farther from them. The streets around Buckingham Palace were crowded and winding, a maze of alleyways and bustling sidewalks that could easily lead someone astray. Amara seemed to pick up on the seriousness of their expressions, her face growing more anxious by the second. She held her teddy bear even tighter, glancing up at the guard with pleading eyes. Is she lost too?" she asked, her voice trembling. The guard knelt down beside her, choosing his words carefully. "I think she might be looking for you just as hard as you're looking for her. But don't worry, Amara. We're not going to stop until we find her, okay?" She nodded, though her grip on his hand tightened, her gaze darting from side to side as if expecting her mother to appear any moment. But as the minutes stretched on, her small shoulders began to slump, the hope in her eyes dimming. Then suddenly, over the crackle of the radio, came a faint but urgent message. "We have a woman matching the description, north side of the park, near the large gate. She seems distressed, calling for a child." The guard's face lit up with relief, though he kept his expression steady for Amara's sake. He spoke into his radio, confirming the location and sending additional guards in that direction to intercept her. Then he turned to Amara, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. "Amara, I think we might have found her. She's nearby. Let's go see if it's her, all right?" Her eyes brightened, and for the first time since she'd come to him, a true smile broke across her face. She nodded, her small legs struggling to keep pace as they moved quickly toward the large gate, the other guards clearing a path through the crowd. People began whispering excitedly, their phones snapping pictures and videos, all eyes following the pair as they moved with purpose, anticipation buzzing in the air. As they approached the north gate, Amara's heart raced with each step, her eyes scanning every face, her breaths coming quicker. She gripped the guard's hand tightly, holding onto him for strength as they weaved through the crowd. She couldn't see her yet, but she could feel it. Something deep inside told her that her mother was close, closer than she'd been all morning. But then, as they reached the edge of the gate, she froze, her steps faltering as her gaze landed on a woman in the distance. A woman with dark curls, wearing a familiar jacket, her head turning desperately from side to side, calling out, her voice barely audible over the noise of the crowd. "Amara." The woman called, her voice raw with worry. "Amara, where are you?" Amara gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with recognition. "Mommy," she cried, her voice breaking as she took a hesitant step forward, her heart pounding. But before she could move any closer, a sudden surge of the crowd pressed against them, and for one agonizing moment, she lost sight of her mother as people shuffled and moved around them. Panic gripped her, her breaths coming in short gasps, and she clutched the guard's hand desperately, her small fingers trembling. The guard acted quickly, pulling her close to shield her from the crowd, his eyes fixed on the woman now frantically searching, her face a mixture of fear and hope. He could see the exhaustion on her face, the tear stains on her cheeks, the desperation in her eyes as she called her daughter's name over and over again, her voice growing hoarse. The guard glanced down at Amara, her face filled with both fear and excitement, and he could feel her entire body shaking with the intensity of the moment. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and brimming with tears. "Is that her?" she whispered, as if afraid that saying it too loudly might somehow break the spell. "Yes, Amara," he said softly, his voice steady and full of warmth. "I think that's her." Her face lit up, but before she could take another step, the crowd surged again, and her mother was swallowed by the sea of people, her voice lost in the chaos. The guard held onto Amara tightly, his own heart racing as he searched the crowd, determined not to lose sight of the woman again. He guided Amara forward, each step careful, his eyes scanning for any opening, any chance to bring mother and child back together. They pushed through the dense throng, the guard clearing a path as best he could, but every second felt like an eternity, each step closer yet somehow further. He could feel Amara's small body trembling with each moment that passed, her quiet sobs barely audible, her hand gripping his as though she might lose herself completely if she let go. Finally, he caught a glimpse of the woman again, her face twisted in grief, her arms reaching out, as if she could sense her daughter just beyond her reach. The guard knew this was their last chance. He lifted Amara gently, placing her above the crowd just enough so she could see, her wide eyes filled with hope and fear. "Mommy!" Amara cried, her voice cutting through the noise, reaching out with all the strength she had left. Amara's voice sliced through the crowd, her desperate cry for her mother rising above the noise and catching everyone's attention. For a split second, the commotion around the palace gates seemed to freeze, and all eyes turned toward the little girl held high by the guard, her small hand outstretched, her face filled with raw hope and fear. Amara's mother turned, her head snapping toward the sound. Her eyes locked onto her daughter, and for a moment, a look of profound relief washed over her face, her lips parting in a cry of joy and disbelief. She took a step forward, her arms reaching out, her body ready to break into a run toward Amara. But just as she moved, a ripple of movement surged through the crowd behind her. A sudden rush of people, tourists, bystanders, all reacting to the sight of the reunion, pushed forward, eager to see what was happening. In the chaos, a figure in a dark jacket brushed past Amara's mother, a tall, shadowy man who seemed to move with unsettling purpose. The guard's sharp eyes caught the flash of the man's face for only a second, but it was enough to set off alarm bells in his mind. There was something wrong. The man's gaze flickered toward Amara, then back to her mother, his face expressionless but intent. He moved quickly, weaving through the crowd, his eyes locked onto the mother and daughter as if tracking them. A chill ran down the guard's spine as he watched, his instincts screaming that this was no innocent bystander. He shifted Amara in his arms, holding her closer, shielding her with his body as he tracked the man's movements. The guard's mind raced, connecting details he'd barely noticed before, Amara's mention of her mother speaking to someone, the man's dark jacket, the description the palace staff had relayed. Could this be the same person? Was this stranger somehow connected to her mother's disappearance? The guard didn't waste another second. He quickly radioed to the other guards nearby, his voice low but filled with urgency. "There's a man in a dark jacket tall near the north gate. He's moving toward the woman we believe is Amara's mother. Watch him closely and approach with caution." Even as he issued the order, his protective instincts surged. He tightened his hold on Amara, his entire focus on keeping her safe. He didn't want to frighten her, but he could feel her small body tensing, sensing the shift in his demeanor. Amara's wide eyes turned to him, worry flickering across her face. "What's happening?" she whispered, clutching her teddy bear tighter, her voice filled with uncertainty. The guard forced a reassuring smile, his voice gentle even as he kept his eyes on the crowd. "It's okay, Amara. We're just being careful. I promise to keep you safe, remember?" She nodded, though her gaze lingered on her mother, who was now fighting her way through the throng, her own eyes full of desperation, her face drawn with worry. But in the midst of the crowd, the tall man in the dark jacket closed in, his movements purposeful and unsettlingly smooth. The other guards had noticed him too, their expressions shifting to match the gravity of the situation. In the next instant, the man reached Amara's mother, stepping into her path, blocking her from moving forward. The guard's heart clenched as he saw her expression shift from relief to confusion, her eyes darting from the man to her daughter. She seemed to shrink back slightly, caught off guard by his sudden presence, but he leaned in, saying something to her that the guard couldn't hear, his body language tense, almost aggressive. The crowd shifted again, more people pressing forward to see what was happening. The other guards moved closer, their eyes locked onto the man, ready to intervene, but the sheer number of people made it hard to get a clear path. Every second that passed felt like an eternity, each heartbeat heavy with the weight of the unknown. Amara's mother tried to move around the man, her face filled with a desperate urgency, her eyes fixed on her daughter, but he blocked her again, his arm extending in a way that made her flinch. She looked up at him, her face a mixture of fear and defiance, her lips moving as she spoke, though her words were lost in the noise of the crowd. The guard's grip on Amara tightened, his body braced for whatever might happen next. He knew he couldn't let her down. He promised to keep her safe. But even as he tried to comfort her, he could feel the girl trembling in his arms, her own gaze fixed on the stranger confronting her mother. "Why? Why is he stopping her?" she asked, her voice breaking as she tried to hold back tears. "Why won't she come to me?" The guard took a deep breath, his voice soft but firm. "Don't worry, Amara. We're going to make sure nothing happens to her. I need you to be brave for just a little longer, all right?" Amara nodded, though her face remained tense, her fingers clutching his sleeve as if it were her last lifeline. Her small voice was barely a whisper. "I just want my mommy." The palace guards finally reached the tall man, surrounding him with a quiet authority that left no room for argument. They gently but firmly guided him away from Amara's mother, their hands supplely at the ready, their stances strong, protective. The man resisted at first, his eyes flashing with irritation, but he relented as they led him aside, his gaze lingering on Amara's mother with an unsettling intensity that made the guard's heart pound. Amara's mother, finally freed from the man's presence, rushed forward, her arms outstretched, her face filled with pure relief as she locked eyes with her daughter. The crowd around them seemed to fade away, their voices hushed as mother and child reached for each other, their hearts racing with the promise of reunion. But just as Amara reached out, her hand brushing her mother's, a sudden commotion erupted behind them. The tall man, in a quick, unexpected motion, broke free from the guard's grasp, his expression twisted with a fierce determination. He moved toward Amara and her mother, his stride long and deliberate, his eyes cold and intent. The guard reacted instantly, stepping between Amara and the approaching man, his body shielding her with unwavering resolve. He reached for his radio, alerting the other guards, his voice sharp, urgent. "All units, we have a hostile individual approaching the north gate. Immediate assistance required." The guards responded at once, converging on the area, but the man's gaze was fixed solely on Amara's mother, his eyes gleaming with an unnerving purpose. He took another step forward, his voice low, his words lost to the crowd, but his intention unmistakable. Amara's mother pulled her daughter close, her face pale but determined, her arms wrapped protectively around her. She looked up at the guard, her eyes filled with gratitude and fear, silently pleading for him to help, to keep her child safe. The guard nodded, his stance unwavering, his voice steady as he spoke to her. "I'll make sure you're both safe. Just stay close to me." With a quick, decisive motion, he gestured to the other guards, forming a protective barrier around Amara and her mother, creating a path that would lead them away from the crowd, away from the threat. The tall man continued to approach, his expression unreadable, but the guards held firm, blocking his way, their faces hard, resolute. Amara clung to her mother, her small body pressed against her as though she never wanted to let go, her tears finally spilling over as the weight of everything settled on her. Her mother held her tightly, whispering soothing words, her own tears mingling with her daughter's, her heart filled with relief and fear all at once. The guards, their faces grim, led the small family through the crowd, away from the north gate, each step heavy with the knowledge that they were keeping a promise to protect, to keep safe, to bring a mother and daughter back together, no matter the cost. But even as they moved to safety, the guard couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't over yet. The man's gaze lingered in his mind, a shadow cast over what should have been a perfect reunion. The guard led Amara and her mother through the crowd, each step taking them closer to safety, yet something about the man's cold, focused stare stayed with him, prickling his instincts. He couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't free of danger yet. He glanced back one last time and saw the tall man still watching them from a distance, his face impassive, eyes sharp and calculating. There was something unsettling in the way he remained, as though he had no intention of leaving, even with the guards still flanking him. Amara's mother pulled her daughter close, stroking her hair and whispering soothing words, her relief palpable as she held her child tightly, almost as if she feared letting go would make her disappear again. Amara's tears had turned into quiet sniffles, and she clung to her mother's coat, her little fingers gripping the fabric as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the world. But then, as they neared the gate that led to a more secure area within the palace grounds, the guard's radio crackled with an urgent message. "Hold on, there's more to this," the voice on the radio said. "The man you intercepted near the north gate, he's under investigation. We've had reports linking him to several cases involving missing persons, targeting tourists. He matches the description of someone we've been tracking." The guard's heart raced as he processed the words. The man wasn't just a suspicious stranger, he was potentially dangerous, possibly even involved in organized criminal activity. And somehow, Amara and her mother had unwittingly crossed his path. It explained the man's focus on Amara's mother, the way he'd blocked her path, and why he hadn't simply walked away when confronted. This had never been an accident. He'd seen them alone and vulnerable, and it had nearly cost them everything. He stopped walking, turning to face Amara's mother, his voice low and steady but filled with urgency. "Ma'am, I need you to stay with me a bit longer. We're going to make sure you and Amara are safe, but I need to ask, did that man say anything to you? Anything unusual?" Amara's mother looked up, her face pale with realization. He was trying to help me at first," she stammered. "When I told him I couldn't find my daughter, he offered to look with me. But then he seemed so insistent, like he wanted me to go in a specific direction, even though I told him I thought she'd be near the palace. When I refused, he became strange, almost aggressive." The guard's stomach turned. The man had been trying to lead her away from the crowded areas, from help, from any witnesses who could intervene. He took a deep breath, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. The crowd around them was thinning now, allowing them a brief moment of privacy. "Don't worry," he reassured her, his voice steady and calm. "We have people watching him now. You're safe here. But we'll need a few more minutes just to make sure you're completely out of danger." But as he spoke, he noticed a flicker of movement from the corner of his eye. The man was back, slipping through a narrow side path, his gaze fixed on Amara's mother. His eyes were sharp and calculating, and in an instant, the guard knew he couldn't let his guard down. The man wasn't giving up. Without another word, he motioned to one of his fellow guards, signaling for backup. His colleague nodded, moving quietly but swiftly into position, creating a barrier between the man and Amara's family. They had to act fast. If this man had any intention of harming or following them, he couldn't be allowed to get any closer. The guard turned to Amara and her mother, his voice firm but gentle. "Stay with me and don't look back. We're taking a different route to get you to safety." Amara's mother nodded, her face set with determination as she held her daughter tightly, her grip protective and fierce. The guard led them quickly down a side path that connected to a secure area of the palace grounds, the other guards fanning out to form a protective perimeter around them. The man watched from a distance, his expression unreadable, but he didn't try to follow this time, his gaze instead flickering to the guards, realizing he was now outnumbered and blocked at every angle. As they reached a quieter area, the guard allowed Amara's mother a moment to collect herself. She knelt down, holding Amara close, her voice choked with emotion as she whispered words of love and comfort. Amara nestled into her mother's arms, finally feeling safe, her small face breaking into a smile as she looked up, her wide eyes filled with a quiet, exhausted joy. The guard watched, a deep sense of satisfaction and relief washing over him. They were safe now, out of reach from the stranger's grasp. But just as he began to relax, the man's voice echoed from somewhere nearby, calm but filled with something unsettling. "You can't keep everyone safe forever," he said, his voice low and mocking as he slipped into the crowd, disappearing from sight before the guards could approach. It was a final taunt, a shadow left lingering over what should have been a happy ending. The guard's jaw tightened, his gaze sweeping the area where the man had vanished. But he knew there was little more he could do now. They had foiled whatever plan the man might have had, and Amara and her mother were finally safe. He turned back to them, his expression softening as he saw them standing together, their bond stronger than ever. He knelt down, meeting Amara's gaze, his voice gentle. "You did well, Amara. You were so brave. I want you to remember that." Amara's small face lit up, a shy smile spreading across her lips. She hugged her teddy bear close, nodding as she looked up at him. "Thank you for helping me find Mommy." Her mother echoed the sentiment, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. You've given me back my daughter. I can never repay you for that." The guard shook his head, smiling. "No need for thanks. It was my honor." He stood, giving them a final reassuring nod, then stepped back as they made their way out of the palace grounds, their steps finally free of fear, heading back into a world that felt safe again. He watched them go, a sense of peace settling over him, knowing that he'd done what he could to protect them. But even as they disappeared from sight, he couldn't shake the lingering unease, the memory of the man's mocking words echoing in his mind. He knew the threat was gone, for now, but the encounter had reminded him that vigilance was never ending, that sometimes danger came in the most unexpected forms, even in the midst of a crowd at Buckingham Palace. And as he resumed his position at the gate, his gaze scanning the sea of faces once more, he remained alert, his promise to protect renewed, knowing he'd do it all over again if needed. As the guard resumed his post at the palace gates, he felt the events of the day settling heavily upon him. The encounter with Amara and her mother was still fresh in his mind, every detail etched into his memory. Amara's tiny hand gripping his coat, her mother's desperate eyes searching through the crowd, and the unsettling presence of the man who had vanished into the city's throng. The guard was trained to be steady, unflinching, but this time the weight of his duty felt different. This was not just another day on the job. This was one of those rare moments that reminded him why he wore the uniform, why he stood guard, protecting people who trusted him with their safety. The crowd around Buckingham Palace had mostly dispersed, the earlier buzz of excitement replaced by a calmer, quieter atmosphere as tourists went back to their routines. The guard stood silently, his expression stoic, but his thoughts still lingered on Amara. He wondered if, after the scare of the day, she would find it in herself to be as brave tomorrow, whether the bond she shared with her mother would now feel even more precious. Hours passed, and as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the palace grounds, the guard caught a glimpse of a familiar face approaching from the park path. It was Amara and her mother, walking hand in hand, with Amara now dressed in a little coat that matched her mother's, her hair carefully braided with bright-colored beads that glimmered in the fading sunlight. She was clutching Max, her beloved teddy bear, but there was a new calm in her eyes, a confidence that hadn't been there before. Amara's mother caught the guard's eye, giving him a gentle smile of recognition and gratitude as they came closer. Amara released her mother's hand and, with a small wave of encouragement, ran up to the guard, her face bright with excitement. He watched her approach, his heart lifting with unexpected warmth, feeling a quiet pride that she'd found her courage again. "Hello, sir," Amara said, her voice shy but filled with admiration. She held out her teddy bear. "Max wanted to say thank you for protecting us today. And so do I." The guard knelt down, his heart softening as he accepted the bear with a gentle smile. "It was my pleasure, Amara. Max was very brave, just like you." She grinned, her face lighting up, and her mother stepped closer, reaching out to take her daughter's hand once more. She looked at the guard, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and relief that he knew would take a long time to fade. "I didn't get the chance to thank you properly," Amara's mother said softly, her voice filled with sincerity. "You didn't just protect us today, you brought my daughter back to me. There are no words for how much that means." The guard felt a quiet humility at her words, a deep sense of purpose that went beyond duty or obligation. "I'm just glad you're both safe," he said, his voice gentle but steady. "That's all that matters." They exchanged a few more words, and then Amara, with one last wave, turned to go, her mother leading her back toward the park. The guard watched them walk away, feeling a rare sense of peace as they disappeared from view, knowing they were together, safe and whole again. As the evening wore on and he continued his watch, the guard couldn't help but reflect on the stranger's chilling final words. The city was vast, and though the threat had passed for Amara and her mother, he knew there would always be people who sought to take advantage of the innocent, people who thrived on deception and manipulation. But that was exactly why he would keep standing here, unwavering, ever vigilant. His role wasn't just about tradition or ceremony, it was about ensuring that people like Amara and her mother had a place in the world where they felt safe. Later that night, as he returned to his quarters and set down his heavy hat, the guard thought back to Amara's small voice asking if he was a knight, if he was brave. The question had caught him off guard then, but now he understood it better. The bravery Amara saw in him wasn't about strength or heroics, it was about staying true to the promises he'd made, about protecting those who needed him. It was a quiet, unassuming kind of courage, but one that mattered most in moments when everything else fell apart. The next morning, as he resumed his post at the gate, the memory of Amara's smile and her mother's tearful gratitude still lingered with him. He kept a close watch on the people passing by, his gaze scanning each face with renewed intent. His eyes fell upon families, couples, and children, each of them going about their lives, unaware of the unseen dangers around them. And he felt, once more, the quiet but powerful sense of duty that came with his position, a reminder that sometimes the most profound acts of service were those that left no trace, no acknowledgement beyond the safety of those he protected. Days later, a small, unmarked envelope was delivered to his post. Inside, there was a simple thank you note written in a child's neat handwriting, along with a photograph. It was of Amara and her mother, smiling together in front of a carousel, a perfect snapshot of joy and peace. In the picture, Amara held Max the teddy bear, a colorful pinwheel in her other hand, her eyes filled with the carefree innocence she'd almost lost. The guard tucked the note and the photo into his jacket pocket, carrying them as a reminder of what had passed, a symbol of hope and resilience. He knew he would never forget them, and he held onto that memory as he resumed his watch, a silent guardian for all who passed through the gates of Buckingham Palace. As the days turned into weeks, and the memory of Amara's bravery and innocence softened into a cherished recollection, the guard remained at his post, day after day, knowing that somewhere out there, a little girl named Amara might one day remember the tall guard in red who had protected her without hesitation. He hoped she'd carry the memory of that courage forward in her life, a reminder that kindness and bravery existed in the most unexpected places, even in the stone-faced figures who stood guard over a world that, despite its dangers, was still worth protecting. And as he stood watch, the palace grand and silent behind him, he felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. There would always be new faces in the crowd, new children laughing, new mothers watching over them, and he would be there, ensuring their safety with steadfast resolve. The world was large and at times frightening, but for Amara, for her mother, and for all who needed him, he would keep standing guard, knowing that the smallest acts of bravery could make the greatest difference.